So, as Louis introduced me, I'll be discussing Gaudium and Spes in this talk. And for those of you who were here last year, I'm gonna sort of build on that talk, but I'll do a little bit of review for those of you who weren't here, just to give you a high-level understanding of what this document is about. But what I really want to do with most of my time is to dive into the relevance of this document at the time it was written, but even more so now, and why this document is so important. Even though it's different, it's situated in the council differently than the rest of the documents that have been discussed today. So I would like to, just looking at what the purpose of the document is. Why was it written? It's a pastoral constitution, and that makes it different. Remember, Dr. Wright talked about how Dei Verbum, it's a dogmatic constitution, meaning that it was concerning doctrinal matters in the church that needed to be clarified and affirmed for the faithful. A pastoral constitution is different. There is doctrine, of course, in this document throughout, but the primary concern of the document is to call the church back to a refocused mission in the church's engagement with the world around it. And so hence, it's a pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. Okay, so we're gonna look at the relevance of the church's engagement with the modern world, and what was on you could say, on the mind of the church at the time of the council, and how the principles laid out in the document are just as relevant, if not more so, today in our own times, although a lot of things have changed since the document was written. So, at the time, the document's trying to address the crisis of modern man. And you can say that the primary focal point of the document is to address what we might call the crisis in anthropology. We come out of 2 world wars, the Holocaust. They're in the midst of the Cold War, standing at the brink of nuclear annihilation. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. And the big question is, what is a human being? How is it that in such a short period of time, it would seem, that humanity could turn so viciously against itself? How is it possible that we can do to one another what we've done to one another? And I think, I'll just make this point right now, it's still relevant because we really are standing on the edge of falling into the same abyss right now. It would seem that we haven't learned our lessons. And the same ideologies that created the horrors of the early half of the 20th century are still vying in the world. And we haven't resolved that issue. Now, as a Catholic, I love to say that the problem is that the world just never listens to the church. The church has been said a lot of very important things at the end of the 19th century, which had the nations of the world, particularly in Europe, had they listened, we would have averted the First and Second World War and the Holocaust. But in fact, we didn't. And what's particularly tragic about that is the European continent was predominantly a Christian continent. So we can't quite say that in the same way today. And so in some ways, from an ideological standpoint, the world is in a more precarious position because God has been even more sidelined in world affairs. The document functions as a very nice distillation of Catholic social teaching. So if you want, in a relatively short but still long document, I think it might be the longest document of the Council, but still, it's short insofar as if you want to go to one place where you want to read what the Church has to say about social issues, that's politics, economics, the family, culture, war, peace, the international relations, etc. That's the great place to go and see what the Church has to say. It provides a beautiful framework for human flourishing in a new world order. Now, I use that term new world order in a very, very intentional way, but it means something different today than it did when the Council document was written. The world order that was being addressed then was the world that was emerging out of the Second World War. A world where it looked like democratic institutions had won, when human dignity was being seated and enthroned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations. Like, there was a very positive, there were very key Catholic intellectuals that helped form and shape the world that many world leaders wanted to bring about after the war. And there was a lot of Catholic leaders in that discussion. But we today are seeing the emergence of a very different world order. And again, the framework of human flourishing that the document gives us is still the framework that the world needs if we want to flourish. And the reason for that is because the Church has such a clear understanding of the nature and dignity of the human person, both in terms of our individuality, but also in terms of our communal life together. And we can't get it more right than trying to put into practice what the Church has really proclaimed to the nations is the vision of the human person and the vision of human society that God dreams for our planet and for our human family. I tried to fit the entire outline of the document on one slide. So, it starts out with an introduction, the situation of man today. Like, the reading of the signs of the times. Let's do a 360 and see what's happening, both the good and the bad. And then part 1 is on man's vocation. Part 2 is on some urgent problems. So you could say part 1 is very theoretical. It casts the vision, sort of the theology of the human person that we know both through reason, that is through the natural law tradition, but also through revelation. What is revealed to us in Christ? What do we learn about ourselves through the revelation of Jesus Christ? And then, breaking down part 1, it tackles the dignity of the human person, the community of mankind. These are the actual headings. Man's activity in the universe, which has to do with things like science and technology. And then the role of the Church in the modern world. You know, at this time, and I think probably it's even more so the case today, although I think this tide could change. You know, the world didn't necessarily believe the Church had anything to contribute to world affairs. And why listen? So the Church in this section is trying to tell the world, like, we actually have a lot to say to humankind, whether you're Christian or not, about what it means to live an authentically human life. And the world would be wise to listen to the Church's vision of the human person because we are the experts in humanity. We've been reflecting on this for 2,000 years. Really more than that, if you take into account the Old Covenant period. It's more like 4,000 years we've been reflecting on the nature, dignity, and vocation of the human person. And again, I'd like to point out, it's like, a lot of these terrible things that have happened would have been avoided had we embraced the Christian understanding of the human person. It's created in the image and likeness of God. With respect to part 2, the urgent problems, it starts with first tackling probably the most important institution, and that is the institution of marriage and the family, because that's really the cornerstone of a healthy society. As the family goes, so goes society. So where marriage is strong and children are being raised in a healthy familial environment that's filled with love, everything else in society is just going to go better. But where the family breaks down, we're going to see the breakdown of society. And of course, we can see that with way more clarity today than we could even in 1962. For those of you who were raised in the 50s and 60s, you have that comparison. What was life when you were younger versus the way it is now, particularly for young people growing up. Next, the proper development of culture. So the recognition that the culture has really changed because of technology, and particularly communications and media. And again, when I was in high school, I couldn't imagine what we would be dealing with. Cell phones, smartphones, social media, all the rest. So trying to help us understand what is really the basis of culture, what is true culture and authentic culture. And then fostering peace and the establishment of a community of nations. So at the time, the United Nations is emerging. And again, the United Nations is a very different organization today than it was in the 1960s. Because a lot of the things that they're advocating for are diametrically opposed to Christian values. So that's a tricky place for the Holy See has a seat at the United Nations and has diplomatic relations with more nations than any other entity on the planet. But it's a difficult place to navigate increasingly. This kind of global world of nations. And of course, there's always the problem of war, and we are again beginning to see the war engines firing up, and war and violence being proposed as the solution to our problems. We experience ourselves being very polarized and very, very pitted against each other. And lots of forms of racism and nationalism are beginning to emerge again, which are dangerous. And then the conclusion, the role of Christians and of churches in all of this. What's our role in all of that? So that gives you a high-level picture of what the document is about and the ground that it covers. Obviously, in this amount of time, I could never begin to unpack, but 2 really good places to go, or 3 really good places to go if you really want to understand the church's social teaching. And I want to say this, and I always do whenever I talk about this topic. Catholics are woefully ignorant of Catholic social teaching. Most Catholics get their clues from CNN or Fox News, and that's very unhelpful. It's one thing to get your news. It's another thing, we need to have the right formation as Catholics, especially laity, living in the world and making sure we really think with the mind of the church and we act in the world with the heart of Christ. That's the challenge. And that means that we're not going to be able to be perfectly aligned with any political party. And we have to decide, of course. But there's work that we have to do that has to take place outside of party lines, because we're disciples of Jesus Christ. And we have to be involved. And one of the most important things that we can do, first and foremost, is be educated on the church's teaching. So good places to go. First and foremost, the Catechism. The Universal Catechism covers Catholic social teaching very well. Again, you could read this document, covers it very well. But there's actually an entire catechism on Catholic social teaching called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church. It's a very long title, but you can get it online, you can buy a copy of it, but very useful resource. I wouldn't recommend reading the Compendium cover to cover unless you want to find a way to fall asleep at night. But if you want a resource to go look something up, well, what does the church teach about this issue? You know, you hear something come up on the news. What does the church teach about this? You can go into the compendium and you can look it up. There's a nice, glossary and index. And all of the church's social teaching, going back to the middle of the 19th century, is all distilled and presented in a very systematic and organized way. Whereas when you try to read the encyclicals, there's good bits and pieces all over the place across all the encyclicals. But it's hard to get just a nice, organized, catechetical presentation of the church's teaching, which is why the compendium is a great book for your shelf to sit right alongside the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So I encourage you to do that. All right. So providing a little bit of context for the document, the church in the modern world. When we talk about the modern world, we're talking largely about the world that was shaped by the Enlightenment, and going back to the 1700s in the French Revolution preeminently. But without going into too much history, what emerged is a kind of different social order out of that world. So we saw the advent of democratic institutions and the collapse of absolute monarchies across Europe. You also saw the colonization and the European expansionism, which created the entire colonial system, which we're still living with the legacy of that issue to this day. So you have that. You have a new economic order emerge. So the rise of the middle class and the mercantilist economic system, which opened up the free market system eventually, which then eventually led into the Industrial Revolution, which completely and totally changed the social landscape. You could think about it like this. Up until the Industrial Revolution, everybody worked and lived at the same place. We don't think about this, but you were either a farmer, or you were a shopkeeper, or you worked on a manor. Those are the three basic occupations. You could have been in the military, could be in government, but if you were among the nobility, then you would have been, living out your life as a noble person, hopefully acting nobly. But that whole system collapsed. And what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that the efficiency of industrialization was such that the artisans and the craftsmen out in the villages across Europe particularly, they couldn't compete with the industrial complex. Okay? Manufacturing became so efficient that everybody left their ancestral villages and moved into cities. And they lived in what were pretty much ghetto-like situations. And then the second major thing that happened is, for the most part, it was dads left the home and went and worked long, long hours in factories. Women did too, but even children, but it was preeminently men. And they would come home tired, dirty, exhausted, and then usually die at the age of 40 or 45 from, just overwork, or if they're working in mines or whatever. I mean, we have a taste of that here in Pittsburgh. We were part of you could say, the second wave of the Industrial Revolution. The first was in England and across Europe. But those changes, that industrial complex so radically changed the landscape of social life that the church could no longer assume that everybody understood the principles by which the social order should be organized. We had to make what was implicit explicit. And we had to begin teaching people how we should live and how we should live in this new reality. And so in the late 19th century, probably all of you have heard of Rerum Novarum. Pope Leo XIII put out that very famous document about the working conditions of the working classes and the need to pay just wages and to create working conditions that were in accord with human dignity. And there was that whole reflection. But other things that came out of the Enlightenment period would also different understanding of freedom. This idea of freedom as autonomy, this freedom as self-determination and defining yourself and inventing yourself. I mean, we see that today in a really big way. We also saw the emergence of very different understanding of the nature of human law. And so a lot of these different ideas that had shaped, especially European Christendom, all of that came crashing down. And the fallout of all of those changes were 2 world wars. And what emerges out of the 2-war period is, again, a new world order, and we call it the Cold War era. Because now we see the world divided up into these global ideological blocks between East and West. So this is the time the church has been reflecting on all of these things all this time. But in Gaudium et Spes, she's distilling and gathering together all of these reflections about how life has changed in the modern world, and trying to lay the foundation and the principles for how we can, as Christian people, be a positive influence on the way the modern experiment, you could say, can get worked out. Obviously, we see the advent of very powerful forms of science and new technologies, and of course that's just continued. I mean, think about the personal computer revolution. Think about, now we have AI, like that's the latest thing, and we have no idea how that's going to change our society today. We're speculating about it. Sometimes those scenarios can be pretty apocalyptic. If you watch movies, you may think of like the Terminator movies or some of these movies where AI takes over the world. Well, we'll see what happens, but the challenge for us as a Christian people is, how do we humanize these technologies? How do we ground these technologies in the dignity of the human person? How do we put them at the service of the vision of humankind that God has, rather than becoming enslaved to these technologies, or worse, destroyed by them? So I talked about the social transformation and the 2 world wars. So the church, the modern world, is the world that modernity created. Now, in the next slide, we're going to talk about post-modernity, because that's the time we live in now. We live in a post-modern world. And a lot of times people hear that and they're like, what's that? All right, but before I get to that, I want to talk about just some of the limits of the document. And in doing this, I'm not trying to be critical of the church. This is, 60 years of reflection by church leaders and theologians on what have we learned, what do we not maybe get right, what did we not see at the time that the document was written. Some people would argue that the document, or just the council in general, was an hour late and $1 short. The intention was to have Vatican II right after Vatican I. But there was too much war happening for that to happen. And so when World War II ended, they took a breath for 15 years and went, I think we're done. Maybe we can gather Vatican II together and finish what we started. But things had changed so dramatically. I guess hindsight's always 20/20, but wouldn't it have been nice if the discussions that were happening at Vatican II were happening in the late 19th century, especially Gaudium et Spes. However, you can also say, well, maybe we wouldn't have been able to have the same kind of discussion we needed to have then, because we didn't fully see what we needed to see. It's a toss-up. But a naive optimism. Some believe that Gaudium et Spes was too optimistic and too hopeful that the world was going to go along with the vision of the council. It really looked like it was, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. You know, we had the advent of the pill, and the advent of abortion, and the whole sexual revolution by the late 60s, and, you know, it was like an avalanche. So maybe maybe there wasn't enough. There was a little too much giddiness in the air and optimism about how on board the world was with the vision of the council, when really there were other agendas at work that had no interest in what the church had to say still, and maybe some of those ideologies sort of went underground for a little while and have reemerged and resurfaced. That, of course, became pretty obvious during the Cold War. Okay, but the Cold War was underway at this point in time. And there was another moment like this, too. Anybody guess when the next moment of kind of optimism, when it seemed like there was a breakthrough? And anybody have any? Pope John the 23rd. Well, he was, of course, John Paul II. Well, yes, of course, under his pontificate, but there was a very important world event that took place during his pontificate. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. It was like, you know, okay, now it's finally over. But then we entered into this age of terrorism and this age of globalization and this new global order that's emerging. So a whole new set of problems. But at any rate, the postmodern critique, part of what has happened, and this is more outside the church than inside the church, but the architects of postmodernity, these are people like, if you've heard of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, people like this. There is a generation of very influential thinkers that very much deconstructed and critiqued modernity and have worked very hard to undermine it. Okay? Just to give you a very clear example, I think it's in this country, going back to CNN and Fox News, you see the two sides of the polarity tugging against each other, because you have kind of a postmodernist, you know, it's very much shaped by what's called critical theory, which is some variant of Marxism on the left, and you have a kind of more classical liberalism on the right that wants to go back to more of the period of the Enlightenment. And there's this like tug of war ideologically that is going on even in our own country and across the world. But of course the church isn't going to subscribe to either side of that equation. Okay? So the challenge that we face today is that we live in a postmodern and a post-Christian world. And that's a very different world that the church has to proclaim the gospel to than the one in 1962. That makes sense. So we're dealing with, for example, gender ideology. Like, even when I was teaching high school in the 90s, it didn't even occur to me that we would be having discussions about bathrooms. Or whether you are a boy or a girl. Like, that was inconceivable. Okay? That's very much a postmodern thing. Through the total and absolute expression of my freedom, I can do whatever I want. I can invent myself and construct myself any way I want to. That's a postmodern idea. I always say postmodernity hit, this is a joke, but hit the mainstream as soon as someone thought it was okay to wear tennis shoes with a suit. All right. I like that. All right. We also have what, going along with the postmodern critique, what happened in the inside the church is what we call the collapse of decadent Christianity. That's a quote from Bishop Barron, from his book, The Priority of Christ. Modern Christianity during the Baroque era, like the 1700s, 1800s, was a very decadent form of Christianity. And that culture was sustained by a lot of very powerful and very strong institutions. And in the 1960s and 70s, the last strongholds of Christendom collapsed. So we are a church that, while we still have assets and resources, we're poor. We're a poor church in the sense that we don't have the kind of weight and influence that we once had, which is really good news, actually, because it means that we have to go back to the very first principles of the curriculum, of proclaiming Christ to the world, of making disciples for Jesus. We have to go back to the basics because we don't have these big, powerful social institutions that are kind of propping up the faith. Okay? And then, of course, one thing that the council document doesn't anticipate is the credibility problem that's on the horizon with clergy scandals, and how difficult it's going to be to engage the modern world when the modern world can so easily dismiss what the church has to say because of her own hypocrisy. So it's a tough time right now. That doesn't mean, though, that the document isn't just as, if not more, relevant today than it's ever been, because the truths that are contained therein are timeless and more needed now than ever, because you can say the light shines darker or brighter in the darkness. Like there's more darkness around the world, and so the light of the church's teaching will shine ever brighter. So how does the church guide and speak to the community of nations about some of the things that are going on in the world today? Very, very complex issues. And the principles remain timeless. But how do you apply the principles in an age of terror, for example? What does just war theory mean? How do you apply the just war theory when somebody could literally fly a single engine plane over New York City and drop a dirty bomb the size of a lunchbox over the city and annihilate the entire population? What does a preemptive strike look like? These are difficult and complicated questions that the church has continued to wrestle with since the council. We are now in the full throes of a consumer society. The efficiency with which we can produce and move goods around the planet today, and what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture. We just fill our landfills with stuff that's so disposable. Everything's disposable. But there's an ethic that goes with that mentality and that mindset, because when you cultivate a culture of throwing everything away, you just throw people away too. Okay? We just saw a horrific, the whole situation that happened with that healthcare executive. That's a complicated issue. You know, on the one hand, you have someone who thinks, well, yeah, I mean, I just don't like what this person's doing, so I'm going to shoot them in the back. But on the other hand, where's the moral responsibility of corporate America? Like, who's holding people accountable for the abuses? Very complicated. Anybody who's ever tried to get a get their health insurance to pay for something, I understand the struggle. So I'm not trying to justify anything here, but you see it's complicated. The lines aren't so clean, and the church has to continue in her social teaching to reflect, discern, and try to apply principles in a world that's always shifting. And the consumer society is one in which we struggle to live with depth or any sort of transcendence of spiritual values, because we're just so caught up in our materialism and so on. Obviously, the clergy scandal I mentioned. We live in a digital age. As a parent, I'm still trying to figure out what to do about a smartphone and video games with my children. My youngest is 17. I think I'm getting out of the woods here, but there was a difference between my oldest and my youngest when it came to a smartphone. With my youngest, he's in 7th grade, and his coaches are texting. That's how they're communicating. And I have my son telling me, well, this is how all the kids communicate. So if I don't have a smartphone or I can't text. It's a flip phone. I can't we had no phone until you're 16, you don't need one, but that didn't work very well. It was very difficult. So how do we deal with some of the challenges of the digital age? And again, AI technology is another huge issue. And then the idea of radical ecology, one of the things I want to say about this is that the ecological movement has become a new religion. There's a kind of new messianism there. And we have to both speak into the need to steward the earth, but we also have to do that in a way that doesn't worship the earth or denigrate the human person in being good stewards of the planet. And again, the church has to discern this. The principles are all there in Gaudium and Spes. How does the human person relate to the creation? And what is the nature and scope of our dominion over the earth? What should that look like? But we have still a lot to learn. The technology just keeps pushing out. And a lot of the radical ecology is tied up with a lot of pantheistic religion. It's tied up with a lot of kind of radical feminism that is not in alignment with our Christian understanding of men and women and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things to sift through. And then finally, we're dealing with the identity politics and wokeism and all of the social implications and ramifications of that. So again, Gaudium and Spes is like an anchor document. It's really important in its value because of the founding principles of how the church thinks through these issues. And it's so important for us to be educated so that we, in this time, can think through these issues, whether that is in the context of doing ministry in a parish or being parents and just engaging our own children around all of this stuff. All right, so the ongoing relevance of Gaudium and Spes, I don't think it's really lost any of its doctrinal relevance or any of its pastoral relevance. More than ever, we as Christian people need to be engaging the world. We don't want to retreat into a bunker or into a little, enclave or become sectarian because the world out there is too scary. That's not the Christian vocation. Our call is to go out with the mission of Christ and transform the world, and that means we have to show up. But we have to show up as well-formed and mature disciples of Jesus so that we don't just get swept away with the tide and caught up in the mainstream, so to speak. So I like to talk about the divine persistence of Catholic social teaching. As a parent, we all know that we tell our kids the same thing a million times. And there comes a time when they grow up enough and have had enough life experience where they realize, wow, Mom and Dad might have known something about what they were talking about. And I can guarantee you that if you were to go in and read what the church was saying in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you would be absolutely blown away with how prophetic the church's vision is and how far down the road the church could see that where things would go. If we start here, this is where we're going to end up. Those documents describe the world we live in perfectly. And I don't even think those folks could have imagined just how concretely those things were going to come to be if we continue down this path. So there's a persistence in Catholic social teaching, and that's because the church is set up as a prophet among the nations. And prophets speak the word of God to the nations of the world, to the principalities and powers of the world. And that prophetic word is always timeless. It's always relevant. I mean, you can go back to all the prophets today, and you're going to find the same guiding principles that are going to make the world a better place today as they would make the world a better place back then. Okay. The church's social teaching is also a law for the nations. It's like if you want to know the rules that we should live by in order to get along, to bring peace, the church's social teaching is where you find that law. And I already said this, but a poor church is more evangelistic. So in one respect, I think the note I'll end on here is to say that the church is actually in a better place today than it's probably been in 2 centuries. Precisely because we have nothing left but the witness of our faith. And our witness, the witness of our faith to the world is the only thing we've ever actually really ever had. But when you build a civilization, you can think that you're going to build the kingdom of God with political institutions, with economic institutions, and things like that. Obviously, it's always good to use those institutions to aim at the good, to use them for God's purposes, but they're not going to save us. And so the beauty of the church's position right now is that in her weakness and in her vulnerability among the nations, the power and strength of the gospel can come through way better. But we need to get out there and proclaim the gospel. We need to be witnesses, as Christ told us in the beginning. So, this is what we need, integral formation for the laity. We need to give priority to a missionary discipleship. That is a disciple that goes out into the world. We need the power of our authenticity and our joy. And we need to, we're exiled into the secular Babylon, but we need to live, as Jeremiah 29 tells us, in the world, making the world a better place around us. Plant your gardens, build your homes, have families, get out there and make the world better, and seek always what I like to call the elevated center. Okay? Don't go left, don't go right, go up to Jesus. All right, I just want to throw this little ad up here really quick. I wrote a book called Wounded Witness, which is, it's really on the post-conciliar pastoral challenges of the church since Vatican II. And it's available on Amazon for your purchase. I don't have copies, but it really dives into a lot of the issues that the church has faced pastorally and proposes a vision for how do we move forward from this present moment, particularly with all the divisions and contentions that we see inside the church right now. So anyhow, I'm finished. Thank you very much.